Dear students, welcome to today's lecture on World War I Causes and Consequences. The main objectives of the lecture are to understand the origin of World War I, to explore the main causes that led to the outbreak of World War I, to understand World War I from different levels of analysis, and to examine the impact of World War I on world politics. The First World War, also known as the Great War, began among European states on European battlefields and then extended across the globe. It was the first modern, industrialized total war, as the belligerents mobilized their populations and economies as well as their armies, and as they endured immense casualties. The First World War led to demise of 4 European empires: Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman in Turkey. World War I killed more than 10 million people. It was a horrifying war of trenches, barbed wires, machine guns and artillery that ground up a generation of Europe's youth. Until World War I, the global balance of power was cantered in Europe. After World War I, Europe still mattered, but the United States and Japan emerged as major players. World War I also ushered in the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the beginning of the ideological battles that racked the 20th century. Origin of World War I. The outbreak of war in 1914 is often seen as the beginning of the short 20th century, the period during which world politics was dominated by the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, and which ended in 1989 to 1991. World War I has been described as the most significant war in world history. It was the first example of total war, meaning that domestic populations and the patterns of civilian life, the home front, were more profoundly affected than by earlier wars. The war was also genuinely a world war, not only because through the involvement of Turkey, fighting extended beyond Europe into the Middle East, but also because of the recruitment of armies from across the empires of Europe and the participation of the USA. World War I was the first modern war in the sense of being industrialized. It witnessed the earliest use of, for example, tanks, chemical weapons like poison gas and flamethrowers, and aircrafts including long-range strategic bombing. World War I was precipitated by the assassination in June 1914 of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, nephew of the Austrian Emperor, by the Black Hand, a group of Serbian nationalists. This precipitated declarations of war by Austria-Hungary and Russia, which, thanks to a system of alliances that had been constructed over the previous decade, led to a wider war between the Triple Alliance, Britain, France and Russia, and the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Other states were drawn into the conflict, notably Turkey and Bulgaria on the side of the Central Powers, and Serbia, Belgium, Luxembourg, Japan, Italy, Romania, Portugal, Greece, and most significantly the USA on the side of the Allied powers. The eventual victory of the Allies was probably accounted for by their greater success, perhaps linked to their democratic systems in mobilizing manpower and equipment. By their earlier and more effective use of mechanized warfare, and ultimately by the entry of the USA into the war. However, there was and remains considerable debate about the origins of the war. The main causes that have been linked to the outbreak of World War I are the German problem, the Eastern question, imperialism, and nationalism. Let us discuss these one by one. The German problem. The origins of the First World War have long been debated. For the victorious Allies, the question of how war began became a question of how far Germans and their allies should be held responsible. At Versailles, the victors imposed a statement of German war guilt in the final settlement, primarily to justify the reparations they demanded. Debates among historians about the war's origins focus on political, military, and systemic factors. Some suggest that responsibility for the war was diffused, as its origin lay in the complex dynamics and imperatives of the respective alliances. The German problem draws attention to a phenomenon that has many and diverse interpretations. Realist theorists who believe that the basic inclination of states towards the acquisition of power and the pursuit of national interest can only be constrained by a balance of power argue that Europe's instability stemmed from a structural imbalance which had resulted from the emergence through the unification of Germany in 1871 of a dominant power in Central Europe. This imbalance encouraged Germany's bid for power, reflected, for instance, in its desire for colonies and in growing strategic and military rivalry with Britain, especially in terms of naval power. Alternative interpretations of the German problem, however, tend to locate the source of German expansionism in the nature of its imperial regime and in the annexationist ambitions of its political and military elites. The West German historian Fritz Fischer, however, argued in his influential 1967 book, Germany's Aims in the First World War, that German aggression, motivated by the internal political needs of an autocratic elite, was responsible for the war. Whatever the causes, the pattern of events is clear. A Serbian nationalist's assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, triggered Austro-Hungary's declaration of war against Serbia. Russia's alliance with Serbia and Germany's alliance with Austro-Hungary then became catalysts for Europe-wide conflict. Germany feared war on two fronts, against France and Russia, and so attacked France in search of a speedy victory. This not only failed, but British treaty obligations to Belgium brought the United Kingdom into the war. The most famous expression of this was in the writings of the German historian Fritz Fischer, who emphasized the role of Weltpolitik or world policy in shaping Germany's aggressive and expansionist foreign policy during the reign of Kaiser Wilhelm II, 1888 to 1918. This view, in effect, blames Germany for the outbreak of World War I, something which the Allies expressed through the war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The Eastern question. The fact that World War I broke out in the Balkans and initially involved declarations of war by Russia and Austria-Hungary highlights the significance of the so-called Eastern Question. The Eastern Question refers to the structural instabilities of the Balkan region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These instabilities resulted from a power vacuum which occurred through the territorial and political decline of the Ottoman Empire, which had once covered the Middle East, much of Southeastern Europe, and parts of North Africa. This meant that the Balkans, a region consisting of a complex pattern of ethnic and religious groupings, which by the late 19th century were increasingly animated by nationalist aspirations, sparked the expansionist ambitions of two of Europe's traditional great powers, Russia and Austria-Hungary. But the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914 may have remained a localized incident. As it was, it led to war between Russia and Austria-Hungary, which turned into a continent-wide war and eventually a world war. Imperialism. Wider explanations of the outbreak of World War I have drawn attention to developments such as the advent of imperialism and the impact of nationalism. As discussed earlier, the late 19th century had witnessed a remarkable period of colonial violence. Marxist historians have sometimes followed Lenin in viewing imperialism as the core explanation for World War. Lenin portrayed imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, arguing that the quest for raw materials and cheap labor abroad would lead to intensifying colonial rivalry amongst capitalist powers, eventually precipitating war. However, critics of Lenin's Marxist interpretation of World War I have argued that in interpreting imperialism as essentially an economic phenomenon, he failed to take account of a more powerful force in the form of nationalism. From the late 19th century onwards, nationalism had become enmeshed with militarism and chauvinism, creating growing support for expansionist and aggressive foreign policies amongst both political elites and the general public. In this view, the spread of chauvinist or expansionist nationalism both fueled new imperialism and created intensifying international conflict, eventually leading to war in 1914. Nationalism. However complex or contested the origins of the Great War, the motivations of those who fought were more explicable. The peoples of the belligerent nations shared nationalist beliefs and patriotic values. As they marched off to fight, most thought war would be short, victorious, and in many cases glorious. The reality of the European battlefield quickly proved otherwise. Defensive military technologies, symbolized by the machine gun and trench warfare, triumphed over the tactics and strategy of attrition. It was not until November 1918 that the Allied offensive finally achieved rapid advances that helped end the fighting. War was total in that whole societies and economies were mobilized, men were conscripted into armies and women into factories. Germany's western and eastern fronts remained the crucibles of combat, although conflict spread to other parts of the globe, as when Japan went to war in 1914 as an ally of Britain. Most importantly, the United States entered the war in 1917 under President Woodrow Wilson, whose vision of international society, articulated in his 14 points, later drove the agenda of the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Levels of analysis. Generations of historians have examined the origins of World War I and tried to explain why war came. Joseph S. Nye Jr., in Understanding International Conflicts, argued it is impossible to isolate one cause, but it is possible to break the question down into distinct levels. At each of these levels, the balance of power as a multipolar system and as the policy of separate states and individual leaders is essential to an understanding of the war's outbreak. As the alliance system became less flexible, the balance of power became less multipolar and the likelihood of war increased. Three levels of analysis, parts of the answer lie at each of the three levels of analysis. First, at the system level explanations, both the structure and the process, then at the domestic societal level, and finally at the individuals. At the structural level, there were two key elements: the rise of the German power and the increased rigidity in the alliance systems. German heavy industry surpassed that of Great Britain in the 1890s, and the growth of German gross national product at the beginning of the century was twice that of Great Britain's. Germany transformed some of its industrial strength into military capability, including a massive naval armaments program. A strategic aim of Germany's Tirpitz Plan of 1911 was to build the second largest navy in the world, thereby advancing itself as a world power. This expansion alarmed Britain's First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. Britain began to fear becoming isolated and worried about how it would defend its far-flung empire. Britain's response to Germany's rising power contributed to the second structural cause of the war, the increasing rigidity in the alliance systems in Europe. In 1904, parting from its geographically semi-isolated position as a balancer off the coast of Europe, Britain moved towards an alliance with France. In 1907, the Anglo-French partnership broadened to include Russia, already allied with France, and became known as the Triple Entente. Germany, seeing it encircled, tightened its relations with Austria-Hungary. As the alliances became more rigid, diplomatic flexibility was lost. The balance of power could no longer operate through the shifting alignments that characterized the balance of power during Bismarck's day. What about changes in the process? One was the continued rise of nationalism. In Eastern Europe, there was a movement calling for all Slavic-speaking peoples to come together. Pan-Slavism threatened both the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, which each had large Slavic populations. A nationalistic hatred of slaves arose in Germany. A second cause for the loss of moderation in the early 20th century balance of power was a rise in complacency about peace. This is an example of the importance of changing ideas that constructivists emphasize. The great powers had not been involved in a war in Europe for 40 years. Darwin's ideas were used to justify the view that the strong should prevail. And if the strong should prevail, why worry about peace? A third contributing factor to the loss of flexibility in the early 20th century balance of power was German policy. The Germans were no different from other colonial powers in having world ambitions, but they managed to press them forward in a way that antagonized everybody at the same time. Just the opposite of the way Bismarck played the system in the 1870s and 1880s. Kaiser focused too much on hard power and neglected soft power. Thus, the rise of nationalism increased complacency. Social Darwinism and German policy all contributed to the loss of moderation in the international system and helped contribute to the onset of World War I. The second level of analysis allows us to examine what was happening in domestic society, politics, and government prior to World War I. We can safely reject one explanation at that level. Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin's argument that the war was caused by capitalism. But two other domestic causes need to be taken more seriously. The internal crisis of the declining Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires and the domestic political situation in Germany. Both Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Turkey were multinational empires and were therefore threatened by the rise of nationalism. In addition, the Ottoman government was very weak, very corrupt, and an easy target for nationalist groups in the Balkans that wanted to free themselves from centuries of Turkish rule. The Balkan Wars of 1912 pushed the Turks out, but in the next year, the Balkan states fell to war among themselves. Another important domestic level explanation of World War I lay in the politics of Germany. German historian Fritz Fischer and his followers argue that Germany's social problems were a key cause of the war. According to Fischer, Germany's efforts toward world hegemony were an attempt by German elites to distract attention from the poor domestic integration of German society. He notes that Germany was ruled by a domestic coalition of landed aristocrats and some very large industrial capitalists called the coalition of rye and iron. This ruling coalition used expansionist policies to provide foreign adventures instead of domestic reform. In fact, as we have seen, the prevailing military technology of the day did not favor the offense, but European leaders believed that it did, a phenomenon we can explain at the individual level of analysis. The first level of analysis, the role of individuals, what distinguished the leadership on the eve of World War I was its mediocrity. The Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph was a tired old man who was purely in the hands of General Conrad and Count Leopold von Berchtold, his duplicitous foreign minister. Ironically, Franz Ferdinand, the crown prince who was assassinated at Sarajevo, would have been a restraining force, for the potential heir had liberal political views. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II was an isolated autocrat who spent most of his time resisting change at home. He was served by incompetent foreign and defense ministers and was strongly influenced by his sickly and neurotic wife. Most important was Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had a great sense of inferiority. He led Germany into a risky policy without any skill or consistency. Personality did make a difference. There was something about the leaders, Kaiser in particular, that made them significant contributory causes of the war. Let us now discuss the consequences of the war. Impact on Germany. Rule of king ended in Germany. Germany became a republic on November 1918. The German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to Holland. Germany had to return Alsace-Lorraine to France. Its colonies were shared, give up Saar coal field, Polish corridor, and made city of Danzig independent. Monarchy was abolished in Germany, Austria, Hungary, Turkey, and Russia. Human cost. The Great War was indeed at the time the most destructive war in history. It killed over 10 million men, wounded countless others, destroyed economies, and led to massive starvation and political and social upheaval throughout Europe. The bloody character of this conflict was unprecedented. Destruction and need of reconstruction. The territories located in combat zones such as Belgium, Italy, and Serbia had been devastated. France was particularly damaged in the north and east of the country, where the battlefront had lasted 4 years. Some villages were literally wiped off the map. Agricultural land was rendered useless by exploding shells. Factories had to be rebuilt or reconverted for peacetime production. Reconstruction began in a context of currency devaluation, inflation, and indebtedness. The conflict had, however, spurred technological development that benefited certain companies in production types or processes. During the years that the war was fought, nations had to provide for themselves, and the habit of self-sufficiency lasted into the post-war years, resulting in economies that were turned inward. Moreover, in the context of reconstruction, internal demand was very strong, absorbing many of the products that had been exported before the war. Currency fluctuations linked to devaluation policies in the United States and Great Britain discouraged the development of external markets. Commercial networks had to be reorganized. Impact on colonies. The European powers involved their colonies in the war, tapping them for fighting men and resources. This would become one of the justifications for the nationalist and liberation movements of the 20th century. Great Britain, with the largest of the world's colonial empires, recognized the sovereignty and the dominions by the Statute of Westminster in 1931. India, which had demanded the same rights since the 1920s, won its independence from Britain in 1947. The Paris Peace Conference. The Paris Peace Conference was where the New World Order born from the 1914 to 1918 war was hammered out. The fact that these peace talks were held in Paris reinforced the idea that Europe was still the center of world diplomacy even after the disastrous war. The belligerent countries had the duty of officially setting the terms at the outcome of the First World War after the signature of the armistice in France on November 11, 1918, which put an end to military hostilities. The peace conference was unprecedented in its form and mandate. The position of the Supreme Council on the matter of reparations was unanimous. Germany must pay. It should not be left to British and French taxpayers to take on the whole burden. The Americans saw this solution as an indirect means of recovering the money they had lent to Europe during the war. Debate on this article of the treaty dealt with the amount and the conditions to set for reimbursement. Compensation. The British also wanted to be compensated, in part so that France would not take all. Their case centered on lost lives, as claims of material damages did not constitute a solid enough justification in the case of Great Britain. However, fearing that excessive severity would compromise the signing of the treaty and would play into the hands of the Bolsheviks, whose influence was growing in Germany at that time, Britain argued against the truncation of German territory. Impact on Russia. In Russia, political changes were precipitated by the war. The Russian Empire was overturned by the Bolshevik Revolution, plunging the country into civil war that ended in a communist dictatorship. Emergence of USA as a superpower. It resulted in the collapse of some of the world's leading empires, the emergence of new nation states, in their place the redrawing of the map of Europe, and the beginning of the American century. Beginning of the end of European supremacy. Japan also became a powerful country in Asia. Independence of Eastern European countries. Poland, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia became new independent states. Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania became independent. Rule of Ottomans came to an end in Turkey. New boundary lines were drawn from Austria, Germany, and Turkey. It strengthened independence movements in Asia and Africa. Failure of League of Nations. League of Nations failed in preventing the outbreak of World War II. The harsh clauses of the Treaty of Versailles finally resulted in the World War II. New literature. The experiences of the war also generated new literature, poetry, art, and film that defined our images of what the Great War was like, and indeed shaped our more general images of war. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture regarding causes and consequences of World War I. Hope you have enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.